Now, in the last teaching, we were introducing the subject of the Syriac Peshitta. I'm not for sure that all of that was clear, but hopefully when I add on to what we said earlier with what we'll say this evening, what wasn't clear will be clarified now. We had seen that we have a terminus a quo of maybe 373. That's because in the publication of F.C. Burkitt in 1901, challenging the commonly held position that the Syriac Peshitta was the oldest Syriac translation, perhaps that would mean, therefore, the oldest translation of the New Testament from Greek into this language of Syriac. In looking through the writings of Ephraim, he found that Ephraim is quoting from another source besides the Peshitta. Of course, we know that to be the Diatessaron. He wrote a commentary on the Diatessaron. And since Ephraim died in 373 A.D., that would have to mean that the Peshitta probably comes after that. So 373 would be a terminus ad quo. A terminus ad quem would be 431. And what do we mean by that? Well, we said that the church divided between the Jacobites and the Nestorians in Syria after the Council of 431. If the Peshitta had not been in existence at this time, prior to 431, as the terminus ad quem, then it'd be a little difficult to comprehend or to understand how both churches, both aspects of the Syrian church, would ever have picked up the same version, the same Bible. Since they were opposed to one another theologically, it would make sense that if the Peshitta comes after, it's posterior then to their division, it would seem a little difficult to comprehend or understand why they're both picking up the same thing. So if we start with terminus a quo of 373, we end with 431, that probably means the Peshitta originates somewhere between these two dates, 373 and 431. Then we looked at some problems with that. We're calling the Syriac Peshitta a 5th century A.D. Bible translation, probably, therefore, an early 5th century for its initial beginnings. But a problem would be, how is it that in Syriac writings among the churchmen and theologians of the 5th century, do we not have any references to the Syriac Peshitta or quotations from it whenever they're quoting the New Testament? If they're quoting the New Testament, of course it'd be a Syriac New Testament, they're quoting either from the Diatessaron or Old Syriac Gospels, or of course there even could be other things that have antedated the origin, the early origin of the Syriac Peshitta. Only way I see that we can explain something like that, which would be an anachronism, an analomy, something that's a little difficult to explain, would be to say that probably it took a while for it to really take root and begin to grow. It would have experienced initial opposition. So whatever was the standard version before the Peshitta comes on the scene, which is supposed to standardize all the various versions, whichever was standard in whichever place that we're speaking of, probably would have continued to exist for a shorter or longer period of time until the Peshitta eventually overrode all of the other versions that came before. Now, that brings us into what I want to discuss tonight. We're going to be looking at the Peshitta again, but probably only for maybe half of the message, something like that. We're going to get into some other Syriac translations here. Originally, the Peshitta did not have what we call the Lesser Catholic Epistles. The Peshitta didn't have this for quite some time. Nor did it have the book of Revelation. The Lesser Catholic Epistles, 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, and the book of Jude. You have graders like 1 Peter and James. The Lesser Catholic, general might be a better term, but we have to go by Catholic because we need that letter C later on, because if you remember how we enumerated before, probably up either on the overhead or on a written board up here before you earlier whenever we discussed Greek manuscripts, then we have to know what do they contain. Do they contain the Gospels, the book of Acts, the Pauline corpus of writing, the general or Catholic epistles, or the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation? So you have an EAPCR little system that you have to have memorized to know whether we're talking about the E, the Evangelist, A, Acts, P, Pauline, C, the Catholic epistles, greater and lesser, or R, the Apocalypse of the book of Revelation. So the lesser Catholic epistles, 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, and Jude, and the book of Revelation. So that's 5 books that the Syriac Peshitta originally does not contain. Furthermore, does not include Luke 22, verses 17 through 18, which is a passage, the institution of communion, where the wine is distributed. We don't know exactly why that one would be excluded, not some other, but it's not just a variant, its omission being a variant, something supplied or nothing supplied in its place, but it's just not found in the original Peshitta. That is, manuscripts that date back to these early times, 6th century and shortly after that manuscripts. Luke 22, verses 17 to 18. Neither does it contain the pericope de adultera, which, that's just a fancy technical name. So they don't give us the fancy names. All right, just the section on adultery in John 8. Pericope just means a section, certain division of a book or a selection of a passage of Scripture, or of anything. It doesn't have to relate just to Scripture. But that's the technical term, pericope de adultera. That would be John 7, verse 53 through John 8:11. Last verse in John 7, I think that's verse 53, it says that every man went to his house. And then in the next verse it says, but then Jesus went, and it tells where he went in John 8 and verse 1. It seems a little difficult to fit into the whole narrative of the end of John chapter 7 because they have a Sanhedrin meeting there, and Jesus obviously is not with the Sanhedrin. So some people have suggested that sounds a little strange. It sounds like we're talking about a breakup of the Sanhedrin meeting with Jesus being there, and John 7:53, every man went to his own house, John 8:1, and then after the breakup of the meeting, then Jesus. They went to their own houses, and Jesus went to such and such a place. That's not necessarily true. That still could fit in there. People think that maybe we have an authentic story being told in the case of adultery. That's the woman, remember, caught in adultery in John chapter 8, the first 11 verses. But it's certainly not found in all of the older manuscripts. So what we're saying is the Syrian canon, then, of the 5th century. The Syrian canon of the 5th century must have been just what I've given you. That is, our canon minus the above things. Now and I say the Syrian canon, because since the Peshitta is nothing but an attempted standardization of existing Syriac manuscripts and translations of the Bible, of the New Testament, it's trying to standardize the other translations so it would take what the other translations have, weed out, and get what is the generally accepted position on a certain passage in translation, and beyond that, a generally accepted position of what the canon of the New Testament is. So that's interesting that we don't have 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, Jude, Revelation, Luke 22, 17 to 18, or John 7:53 through John 8 and verse 11. What does the name Peshitta mean? We gave you various guesses last time. I said that it's a feminine passive participle of a Syriac verb which means stretched out. So it probably means simple or easy. We said maybe simple, maybe easy, as Unger said, in opposition to the complex technical signs and symbols in the marginalia in the Syro-Hexaplar, which was by Bishop Paul of Tella in 617 A.D. That maybe in addition to the fact that just the translation into Syriac is very simple, it's very easy, it's very direct, it's very literal. We can't really say smooth because smooth and literal and smooth and direct are not synonymous of one another, but we can say that it was simple, that it's easy, it's very direct, it's very literal. Maybe we need to combine that with our meaning that we gave last time, the third of 3 proposed meanings for the term Peshitta, P-E-S-H-I-T-T-A. What exactly does that mean? Maybe simple, easy to understand in opposition to a complex Syro-Hexaplar, and easy and simple because it's direct and literal in its translation. For this reason, it's been called, quote, the Queen of Versions by some scholars. So if you see something about the Queen of Versions, not the Queen of the manuscripts, that would refer to something else, but the Queen of the Versions, then sometimes some scholars have reference to the Peshitta in a case like this. However, that does not mean that it's totally reliable. Just because it's simple, it's easy, it's direct, it's literal, it's the Queen of the Versions according to some scholars, that certainly does not mean that it's totally reliable. We haven't actually told you what the Syriac Peshitta really is or looked at any manuscript evidence thus far. I think most of our time was consumed in the last study in biblical literature and looking at Professor F.C. Burkitt's theory particularly about Rabula, exactly who was the man, and we don't think it was a man singular, but some men plural who gave us the Peshitta, and so our time was consumed with that. The Syriac Peshitta is a Syriac translation that's also a revision of existing Syriac versions. The translation seems to be based on Greek manuscripts then in use at Constantinople. They would have used these Greek manuscripts, which were thought to be better, obviously, than going through a Syriac to give us a Syriac Bible, which would more or less make it a secondary translation, not a primary one. And it is a primary. Peshitta appears to be a primary because it does come in the New Testament anyway from the Greek. But it's more than a primary, it's a revision as well, because they have before them, the various scholars doing this, the various men doing this, they have before them the existing Syriac versions. Which ones are those? Those are however many, and which ones we don't know exactly. We've enumerated some of them. But they would have these before them trying to standardize the text. So they would take the Greek manuscripts that were at Constantinople, which was the great center for learning and for manuscript study, as well as manuscript collection and preservation at that time, later known as Byzantium. Today it's known as Istanbul. Of course, Byzantium then eventually gave the name to the Byzantine text type from the manuscripts, the Greek manuscripts stored at Constantinople, which, as I say, later took the name Byzantium. So what we're saying is this later, of course, evolved. These manuscripts that were stored, the more reliable ones they felt at that time, stored at Constantinople, later evolved into the Textus Receptus, the received text. So that means as far as textual affinities are concerned, the Peshitta definitely is some type of cousin or distant relative of the Textus Receptus. There are similarities. And I think we'll find this true with most of the Bible translations that we look at. We'll be looking at the Coptic and the Ethiopic, the Nubian, Arabic, Old Persian, Old Latin, many ones. Well, I think we'll find that a large number of them are taken from Greek manuscripts that later evolve into Textus Receptus. Now, why would we say that's true? See if you can go back in your mind. I mean, that would seem to be opposed to what we would, well, A, hope for, and B, that we would believe that would make any sense at that time. Well, remember the Textus Receptus manuscripts. That's a certain text type, a Byzantine text type. Those are more in number because they're later in history. The large majority of them are later in history. And since they are later in history, that means we have less time during which they can be lost or destroyed or put out of use or whatever. So that would only make sense that as far as most of these translations are concerned, if they're going to have textual affinities, and they do, and some of them are Caesarean, and some of them are the so-called Lucian, and some of them are Alexandrian, but I think most of them will be Byzantine family members. They'll be something like what eventually evolved into the Textus Receptus. Now, you know that's a complicated question, and we've looked at it a little before. We've looked at it a lot before, but a lot more could be said in the complexities of the Textus Receptus. It's not a certain Bible. It's not a certain translation. It's not a certain version. It seems to be a certain group of variants that are found in certain types of Greek manuscripts that we call Byzantine manuscripts with a Byzantine text type. So there are similarities between the Syriac Peshitta and the Textus Receptus, but there are differences as well. That's what always presents us with our problems, why something can be in some regards, such as maybe in the Gospels. It seems to be a kissing cousin, as it were, of Byzantine texts. And then it's Caesarean when you get to Acts, and then it's Alexandrian when you get somewhere else. And then something is a so-called Lucian recension. We didn't discuss a lot of that before, just because it comes under a different name than we're accustomed to. Some people have said we have here in the Peshitta an independent witness to the Greek text of the New Testament, since we have similarities as well as differences between it and the Textus Receptus, a strain which they say no extant manuscript represents. But that would be a little difficult to carry all the way out and to prove. Let's look next of all at the evidence via the manuscripts. You'll remember that with the Diatessaron, we have no extant Greek or Syriac manuscripts. We have just a small 4-inch by 4-inch fragment from Dura on the Euphrates, discovered back in the early part of this century and published in 1933 by Yale University. We've got Ephraim's commentaries now. We have 3/5 of them in Syriac on Tatian's Diatessaron. But that, of course, was the problem of so many scholars because of the fact that the Diatessaron, they would know if it existed at all, came late in the 2nd century, AD 170. And, well, we just don't even believe in the historicity, maybe of Tatian, definitely of the Diatessaron, because I said they have to redate, reevaluate their higher critical theories, and then redate their dates for the canonical Gospels. So we don't have any extant manuscripts of the Diatessaron, but we've been able to prove its historicity and its literal existence in the past. Such is not true with the Peshitta. That is, we do have many manuscripts that are available for the Peshitta. In 1902, C.R. Gregory, Caspar René Gregory, one of the early textual scholars, gave us one of our systems, remember, of enumeration. Caspar René Gregory, in 1902, stated that there were 300 manuscripts of the Peshitta New Testament. Peshitta is a whole Bible, but all we're really concerned about are New Testaments now. That was in 1902. He said that there were 300 extant manuscripts in Syriac of the Peshitta New Testament. However, he didn't take several things into consideration. He didn't take into consideration the obscure Eastern manuscripts. Scholars of America, scholars of Europe were not that familiar. They just have recently become, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, for studies in Armenian, studies in Nubian, studies in Syriac. That's something that's relatively recent, this century really, that Burkitt has begun to study or began to study in that area. So he didn't take into consideration, A, those in the Eastern world, nor, B, the little-known manuscripts in obscure, small Western collections, particularly in private collections. Now, you'll be surprised as we go along. We've given a lot of this information for Greek manuscripts in the past. We've looked at many of the important Greek minuscules, the uncials, the lectionaries, the papyri, those 4 classifications of ancient Greek manuscripts. We've given you different places where the chief ones are found. Of course, some of them in Paris, some of them at the Bodleian Library in England, some of them in the Vatican, some of them in Milan, some of them in Berlin. But you'll find a whole lot of them at the University of Michigan. You'll find, I'm talking about Greek right now. I remember we just continually went over the fact that a whole large number of these manuscripts are found at the University of Michigan. We're going to come to one before too long here that's found at the University of Mississippi, where I'm from, down in Oxford, Mississippi. We're going to see another group from another family, another tongue, another language, where the largest American collection is a private collection by a man out in, I think it's Wichita, Kansas. So you can find a lot of these scattered out, and this is one thing Gregory did not take into consideration, the obscure small Western, not Eastern. The Eastern would be in monasteries. It could be private, but it'd be in monasteries, cathedrals, churches, synagogues, or wherever you'd find older New Testament manuscripts, but we're not familiar with those people or with those languages there. The West, we're familiar with what goes on over here, and travel is relatively easy, and there aren't the communication or the language or the cultural barriers. But when you've got a large number of these manuscripts found in some obscure private collection of some man who lives up in British Columbia, and then some at the University of Miami of Ohio, you're spread out all over the North American continent then, and a lot of legwork has to be done. Gregory said 300 in his day. Probably, of course, more existed in his day. Today we know maybe double this number, 600, which is a fairly large number. 600 Syriac, Peshitta, New Testament manuscripts. Of course, that doesn't compare to Greek manuscripts. We have 5,000. But 600 is a lot better for a lot of the secular works being done prior to this time, as well as concurrent with the translation of the Peshitta. Let's look at just a few examples, not 600, 4, just a few examples. Some of the more significant ones for various reasons. First of all, we'll start with the most significant one. It's known as manuscript 296 in Peshitta studies. Manuscript 296. It's the oldest copy of the Peshitta New Testament. Remember, with the Peshitta in its original composition, we have a terminus ad quo of 373. We have a determinus ad quem of 431. So 431 would be the last date for which it would be possible for at least the Peshitta to have begun to have been translated. Well, surprisingly enough, MS 296, manuscript 296, dates from 464 AD. 464. Just 33 years after our terminus ad quem. What does that say? That says that it must be very, very close to the original work done. We may even have something, we're not for certain about this, but we may even have something here that is just as close to its original as, let's say, the manuscript of the little couple of verses in John 18 that dates from AD 125 is to the original composition of John's Gospel. That, of course, in Greek and this in Syriac. That's a big thing to say. It's in Paris. It's located in the National Library in Paris. And it's just really a fragment of a manuscript which includes Luke 6:49 through 21:37. Not very much of the New Testament, almost all, a large portion of the Gospel of Luke. Luke 6:49 through Luke 21:37, dating from 464, probably the early part of the year 464. Very, very close then to the original work that was done. Then, secondly, let's come to another manuscript. This manuscript is kept at the British Museum. It's known as MS 1442-5. British Museum MS 1442-5. It's rather large. It contains Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which proves, of course, that we have Old Testament in the Peshitta. It dates from the same year, 464. Maybe later than the first one, but it's Old Testament, and we're not as concerned with Old Testament Peshitta as we are with the New. Here in a little note in a colophon. What's a colophon in a manuscript? What's a colophon? It's on that list of technical terms that you have. Colophon. It's that little notation that comes at the end of the work, and it'll have maybe the scribe's name, maybe the year in which it was composed, maybe a few of the surrounding circumstances. The colophon says that it was composed in the year 775 of the Seleucid era, which translates into AD BC years as 464. Written by a man named John. I wonder how many people have been named John in the history of mankind. We don't know which one this one was. It's one of those manuscripts that came from the Nitrian desert. We've mentioned the monastery of Mary, the Mother of God, in the Nitrian desert. Now, I happen to have a picture of this manuscript of Exodus 13, verses 8 through 17. So I'm going to send this around. You see what Syriac writing looks like. Nothing like English, nothing like Greek, nothing like Hebrew. So obviously you will not be able to read it or make anything out. But you can just know it's God's Word, Exodus chapter 13. A third manuscript known as Codex Philips. That's Philips with 2 L's and 2 P's. Codex Philips 1388. A copy of all of the Gospels, all 4 canonical Gospels, acquired in 1865 by the Royal Library of Berlin. Its date is an approximation. That's probably from the end of the 5th century. Of course, these first two we could say more or less are from the middle of the 5th century, 464. So the end of the 5th century, somewhere from 475 to 499. This manuscript represents what I gave you in the end of the last teaching, a quotation from Matthew Black, who spoke of a halfway house. He thinks that a lot of the Syriac work being done there in the 5th century represents a halfway house between the old Syriac and the fully developed Peshitta. And Matthew Black reasons, and of course we think correctly so, that's probably why we don't have a full Peshitta at that time. We have a terminus ad quo of 373 and a terminus ad quem of 431, so it's beginning somewhere in between those two dates there, but we probably have a long process and a period of time over which the Peshitta is actually translated. And so what's happening during the 5th century, although we're going to date the Peshitta from the 5th century, probably only represents what we would call, what he calls a halfway house, something that is between the text of the old Syriac Gospels or the text of Tatian's Diatessaron Syriac translation of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and a fully, completely developed Peshitta. So Codex Philips 1388, and one other that I just jotted down. I could bring just lists of these, but I don't see any reason for doing that. Another British Museum manuscript, and that's MS 1445-9. British Museum MS, sometimes it's MSA double D, 1445-9. One of the... What in the world is this? What in the world is this bell doing up here? I don't know, I get nervous like someone's going to cut me off if they ring that bell there. Throw that thing away. At least it's up here, not out there, though. One of the earliest dated Syriac manuscripts. Not as early as these others, we just gave you one with a colophon of 464. But one of the earliest dated manuscripts from between 528 and 538. That contains Luke and John. That's, of course, up into the first part of the 6th century. 600 manuscripts, between 400 and 600 manuscripts exist of the Peshitta New Testament. How many of these date to the 5th century? That's the century that we're giving as the origin for the Peshitta. Probably no more than a half a dozen date back to the 5th century. Probably these that do date back to the 5th century, such as MS 296, 464, the middle of the 5th century. Probably those who do date back here represent a halfway translation between Old Syriac and the fully, completely developed Peshitta. It'd just be too early to have the fully developed Peshitta because of our terminus ad quem of 431. 6th century, maybe 50 manuscripts of the Peshitta have been assigned to the 6th century, with the few hundreds more coming later on, 7th century and later. So there's a little summary of manuscript evidence. Finally, with the Peshitta, let's look at printed editions. Peshitta is one of the most, it's called the Queen of the Versions, one of the best known other language translations of the New Testament. So with other translations, we don't go into as much detail as we're doing with this, but we'll give you some printed versions. The first printed edition of the Peshitta was made by one Johann Widmanstetter. Widmanstetter. Johann Widmanstetter or Widmanstetter. Widmanstetter, a humanist, senator, and chancellor of Lower Austria, who lived 1506 to 1559. 1,000 copies, which was a large number to run off the press, of this edition were printed in Venice in the year 1555. Printing press, remember, just invented the century before this, the 15th century. That's a large number, and that's fairly early. 1555 in Venice by Johann Widmanstetter. 1,000 copies of this edition were printed at the expense of Ferdinand I, King of Hungary. 3 years later he became the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. But that was before his elevation to that rank. Ferdinand I, King of Hungary. Of course, in this period of the history of Europe, as well as the history of the church in Europe, you have much mixture between religion and politics. And many times those in political circles, kings and monarchs, will foot the bill, as it were, for the publication or the printing of important biblical works, or important ecclesiastical works, even if they're not biblical. They could come just from the writings of the early church fathers. The second edition of the Syriac Peshitta was done in Geneva by Emmanuel Tremelius in 1569. Emmanuel Tremelius, Tremelius. Obviously a Jew with a name like Emmanuel, converted Jew. No other type of Jew would have any reason for printing a New Testament, would he? Professor of Hebrew at the University of Heidelberg in West Germany. Germany of that day, West Germany of today. That's the second printed edition of the Peshitta by Emmanuel Tremelius, a converted Jew and professor of Hebrew at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. An interesting note about this is at the heavenly witness passage, which is what? Do you remember that? 1 John 5:7. 1 John 5:7 is the old, of course that comes from Erasmus, the heavenly witness passage. 3 that bear record on earth, 3 that bear record in heaven. The Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost in heaven. Heavenly witness passage, he has this in the margin. Doesn't put it in the text. He takes it out. Of course, it's obviously been here. It's been in the text. That's not one of the things we've given you, like the lesser Catholic epistles, the Apocalypse, Luke 22:17-18, and Pericope de Adultera. Something that was not included in the Peshitta. It was there, but he obviously knew better than to have it there, and it's lifted out but placed in the margin. A third printed edition, and the first of the Syriac Peshitta editions to contain the disputed books. We could say the Peshitta Antilegomena. The minor Catholic epistles, 2 Peter, 2 and 3 John, Jude, and the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation. First Peshitta Syriac New Testament to include the Peshitta Antilegomena, the disputed books, was one published in Paris in 2 parts, 1630, and the rest of the New Testament in 1633. Here for the first time, Syriac vowels were fully printed. They had never been printed prior to the 1630 and 1633 edition. Then, fourthly, in 1905, the British and Foreign Bible Society, BFBS, the British and Foreign Bible Society, printed a partial Peshitta New Testament in 1905, and then completed it in 1920. Okay, that's all I have to say about the Peshitta. Do you have anything to say? That is, anything to ask before we move on? Just for sake of a translation, and it's being known, not necessarily its antiquity, but it's being known, it's the most important Syriac translation. Of course, we would say probably the most important as far as textual studies, as far as antiquity is concerned, as far as its date of origin, would be the old Syriac Gospels, because those go back to being the first translation into a receptor language of the Greek New Testament. So for us, that would be more important, but only for that reason. But the best known, few people have heard of the Diatessaron. Of course, not church people, but scholarly type people, or not even scholarly type people in between a scholar and just a regular pew warmer out there. Maybe they've heard of something like the Diatessaron. I doubt they've heard of old Syriac Gospels. I doubt they've heard of Canonicity manuscript and text. I doubt they've heard of Sinaitic. I doubt they've heard of Philoxenian. I doubt they've heard of Harclean. I doubt they've heard of Palestinian. But they probably have heard, if they've heard of anything besides Diatessaron, they've heard of the Peshitta. Or I should say, if you've heard of anything besides the Peshitta, it'd be the Diatessaron, because they certainly would have heard of the Peshitta before. So it's probably the most important.
Question. What does date 464 to do with the oldest copy of the Peshitta New Testament? What's that date mean?
464 is the oldest copy of the Peshitta New Testament. What that means is that's the oldest copy. It only comes 33 years after the end date for at least the end of the period of beginning, which is our terminus ad quem of 431 for the division between the Jacobites and the Nestorians of the church in Syria, and therefore the initial translation, beginning aspects and phases of it, of the Syriac Peshitta. We're just saying that's extremely close to whenever the original was composed, the original of Luke. Remember this date 464, since 431 is just a terminus ad quem for the Syriac Peshitta to have had to have begun, then maybe 464, of course this is Luke chapter 6 through chapter 21, a manuscript of Luke, maybe the book of Hebrews has not even been translated by this date of 464.